National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and we're excited that you've decided to join our webinar today. Today's webinar, Reflective Conversations, is presented by Terry Pease with the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health, and hosted by the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance. Before we get started, I'll go over some technical details of the WebEx software that we'll be using for today's webinar. Many of these details are explained in the Using this WebEx System tab on the upper left-hand side of your screen. Be aware that your screen might look a little bit different depending on whether or not you're using a Mac or a PC. On the right-hand side of the screen, there are many boxes. The second from the top is the chat feature. This feature will allow you to provide feedback and share resources with your fellow colleagues, as well as get in contact with the trainers or myself if you have any questions regarding the training content. You can contact Jennifer Curley, also with the center, if you have any questions troubleshooting the WebEx software. To do this, you click the down-facing arrow and select whom you'd like to get in contact with. You'll see a lot of options, but for this session, we're going to use all participants. If you'd like to respond to a question from the trainer or contact me anytime during the session. You should click on Jen Curley to privately contact her if you're in need of troubleshooting the WebEx software. So let's go ahead and test this chat feature. Can everyone please go to the chat box, click on all participants, and then type in the program that you're calling in from and press enter? Wonderful. I see some folks calling in from the Action Alliance. Glorious, YWCA. Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. At the end of the webinar, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. Please let us know what was useful and what could have been better. If you get disconnected at any point, you can return to the email that you received from with the original webinar link and re-enter the training. If you're experiencing technical difficulties or are unable to contact Jen Curley, you can also call WebEx Tech to resolve any issues. That phone number is 1-866-229-3239, and I'll paste it in the chat box as well. Thank you again for joining us today, and I will now turn the training over to Christine.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this exciting webinar series. I know that we at the Action Alliance are excited to have Dr. Terry Pease with us today, and so we're excited that you all were able to join us. I wanted to first thank those of you who participated in and completed a survey that went out a couple of weeks ago. It was a brief survey asking some questions about the types of topics and questions that you had that you wanted to be addressed through the webinar, and that was extremely informative to us at the Action Alliance as well as to Dr. Pease in planning today's webinar, so thank you for sharing that information with us. I will not read the webinar description to you, so all of you sort of should be well informed about what today's webinar is planned to cover. But I did want to sort of speak to the fact that, you know, we're excited here in Virginia that we've been really intentionally focused on trying to promote and create trauma-informed services throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, and have also been working simultaneously around this concept of voluntary services, and they're very intricately linked in terms of being able to really meet people where they are and really approach it from a very trauma-informed perspective. And so today we're hoping that you all will have your questions asked and learned a little bit more about what it really means to be trauma-informed on all levels. I think for me it really kind of boils down to this concept of oftentimes we get so focused on what we need to be doing and in terms of meeting the needs of folks that we serve, and sometimes don't feel like we have the time to reflect on how we do our work. And for me, trauma-informed services and voluntary services and really meeting people's needs is really also focusing as much on how we do our work and how we interact with not only the people that we're serving, but how we interact with each other as colleagues, and also how we interact with staff as leaders. And so without much further ado, I'm going to take a few moments and introduce Dr. Terry Pease and then turn it over to her. Dr. Peace has an extensive experience as a trauma specialist, trainer, and educator. She has devoted much of her career and time and work addressing sexual assault and domestic violence, trauma and abuse with people with disabilities and in communities of color. She's especially been interested in looking at the intersections of domestic violence, trauma, and mental health, and helping really build collaborations between service providers in the victim services realm and service providers who are working in the mental health realm as well, so that we can better meet the needs of trauma survivors. She's been recognized for her extraordinary work in a variety of different avenues, and I would encourage you to look into that and learn a lot more about the amazing work that she's doing across the nation. We're very pleased and very honored to have her with us here today. In my experience in hearing Terry, she is gifted in her ability to really take the daunting work that we all face every day in working with trauma survivors and breaking it down into really practical solutions that, again, not only help us serve people better, but I think also help us serve ourselves and each other better as we do this important work of working with trauma. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Pease.
Okay, I think my mute is off. Thank you very much, Kate, and hi to everyone out in Virginia. We are kind of bracketing the country here. I'm from up in Maine, where it's gray and still in the 60s, if you can possibly imagine. That's June in Maine. So I hope you guys have warmer weather, and I'm really delighted to be talking to all of you, because this is, as you may know from what Kate has said, and also just from the work I've done on these issues, this is a topic that's really very close to my heart and one that I've been doing a lot of thinking about. I was so delighted to get your comments and your questions in the surveys that you responded to, because it gives me a sense of who you are and kind of where you are in this journey as I think about it, from whatever our original way of working was when we joined this work, when we joined this movement, we began thinking about the issues of survivors and advocates and programs and ourselves, to where you are today in the process of becoming more and more trauma informed. And I really think of it as a journey rather than some fixed thing that we have to be able to do. And that's going to be reflected in what we talk about today. I have a couple questions to get us started. I see that there are 6 attendees on the list, and how many of you have other people at your site? Or let me ask this in a clear way. Do some of you have other people at your site so that there's more than one person listening in a particular office? And I think there's a hand raise function somewhere on our WebEx. I've used it a lot of times and I always miss that. So if you would raise your hand, please, or make a note in the chat if you have other people and how many other people are in your site where you are listening to this webinar. And the reason I'm asking that question, of course, is because if we are a small group, then that gives us a chance to really make this about conversations, which is really what I think is the critical tool in what it is that we want to do. Most of you have been thinking about trauma and trauma-informed practice and for a long time, and understanding that trauma affects both us, the staff with whom we work and the staff we support, and the survivors we support in sexual violence and domestic violence programs. And today what I want to do is to talk to you about a particular way of working together that I'm calling reflective conversations. So that's where we're going. And let's jump right in. We have 90 minutes, and what we're really going to do today are talk about these 3 things. First of all, what do we really mean by this intersection of reflective supervision, strengths-based supervision, trauma-informed supervision, and then given that we understand what it is, why we want to do it, what are the benefits of doing it, and then how are reflective conversations a way for us to start. So let me begin with exactly that kind of question for all of you. And my first question to all of you is, what would make this conversation work together today worth your time? What are you hoping to get out of this? What are you hoping to learn? And let me introduce this process of talking together by saying that this is really first draft thinking and first draft talking, so no one should be held in some fixed kind of way to a comment or a thought or a question that they raise here. This really is about exploring, and that means we have to have the room to try out other things, other thoughts, and to do as I sometimes do, is I think this is what I think, and maybe I'll take it back. So what are you hoping for out of the work that we do together today? And at this moment, I always feel like I need to be a game show host with a little bit of music in the background. But let me guess then, and you can tell me if I've got it right. I'm hoping that you're looking for something very practical, something I can do at the end of this 90 minutes that will help me feel stronger as a supervisor, help me feel that our program does a better job of actually being trauma-informed. Is that a good guess about what you're hoping for in today's work? Great. So then I'm hoping, we've gotten one or two answers, so I'm hoping that that, in fact, is the direction that we're going to go. And here we have another question. Then this is one I've heard in other places. How do you provide support to your staff when you're working out of many different offices? You're not always there with them. And I'm going to talk about the notion of creating learning organizations. And that's going to be a critical tool, especially for those of us who are supervisors and managers and leaders in programs where sometimes we may not see an individual staff person directly. We have got to find ways to jumpstart people working on their own to improve and grow their work, because it can't be just us overseeing someone else's work and saying yes, no, yes, yes, no, no. And so hopefully at the end of this conversation, I'll ask that question again, and I'll prompt Jen or Erin to remind me to ask that question again. Do you have some ideas about how that might work for someone who's supporting more than one office and may not see all their staff in every week? Okay? So that's a good place for us to get started. So let's start with making sure that we have a shared understanding of what trauma is, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I think about how, in very broad terms, trauma affects the experiences of survivors and staff and us, and how we then can understand how our work addresses that. You know, Maxine Harris and Roger Fallett, back at the turn of this century, created that term, trauma-informed services. And it's a really important thing to think about, that there's a difference between trauma-informed and trauma-specific services. Those of us who are clinicians, whose job it is to address and look at the specific impact of trauma in an individual person's life and to attempt to remediate that in a therapeutic kind of way, are providing trauma-specific services and many times trauma-specific treatment. But there's a much broad range of people who should and can be offering services that are informed by these points on the slide that you see in front of you now. First of all, it's to realize trauma is pervasive. And if we were working in the post office or working in McDonald's, we would encounter people who are trauma survivors all the time. But where we work, we can make the assumption that everyone who has walked through our doors in search of services and support and information and help from us has at least skirted the edges of being a trauma survivor, if not being solidly impacted by the traumatizing events of their lives. So we can't walk into our work thinking, well, let me see if I can discover who's been affected by trauma. We have to provide work and services that assume that everyone needs us to be trauma-informed. And that's a really critical point, because it reminds us that we don't have to pick and choose when we use these. This becomes how we work and how we are. And, you know, it's funny. I was just in a doctor's office with my husband the other day, and for whatever reason, this doctor had not noticed that there was a little tiny smear of blood from the patient before. And the notion of universal precautions, which says you're always careful and you're always watchful, is exactly the kind of thinking that we want to do in providing trauma-informed services to everyone. So we know that trauma is everywhere, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a way of thinking about the impact of trauma that I hope will be helpful. Given that we know that trauma is everywhere, then how do we incorporate it into our work, and how do we make sure that what we do does not further traumatize the survivors with whom we work, that the way that we work does not increase the burden of trauma on our staff and our organizations, on ourselves, and that whether we are therapists or whether we are the cook in a shelter or whether we are the person who answers the telephone in a sexual violence program or an emergency room, how is the way we present ourselves a step in service of the healing, the resilience, and the well-being of each person we meet? And I'll give you a little example from when I was doing some work in child welfare in a state in the western part of the country. And I was sort of, the expert coming in for a meeting. I was like, oh, Dr. Pease, when I walked in the door. How are you? Can I get you a cup of coffee? Welcome, welcome, welcome. This was the person who was at the front desk of this organization and answering the phones and checking in clients, as they would have called them there. So I was sitting there reading a magazine waiting for the person who was meeting me for this event, and then a mother and a couple of kids came in. Same person at the desk, and her presentation to this woman who came in the door was so different. Yeah, what do you want? All right, I'll see if she's here. The same person using a tone of voice and a style that said, you're not as important, you're not valuable, which means to me that that organization, and I know the organization, wasn't focused on creating the kinds of services that supported each person's well-being at every minute. Now, we come to this work with that kind of bias and assumption, so I'm sure you're all doing that, and I'm hoping that what we do today helps to expand our ability to do that and to sharpen our wits and sharpen our attention. This last point, I sometimes think it should come first, because the work we do is hard. And everyone who comes into our organizations and works with us in the service of survivors of sexual violence and survivors of domestic violence is affected. It's not possible to not be affected. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that just a little bit in today's conversation as well. As we go through today, I'm hoping that if there are questions or comments or things that you want me to pay attention to, that you'll drop a little note in the chat box or make sure that you ask questions so that we're making sure that we get your questions answered as we go along. But I want to start by reminding you that when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about stress. And I'm going to just kind of run through this pretty quickly, but stress basically is part of life. There is no way of living without stress. And stress, of course, is anything that pushes us away from a state of very calm equilibrium and that says, do something, respond, react. And in the ordinary course of ordinary events, the intersection of events in the world, events around us in the environment, and the capacities of the person who's affected come together so that if a person gets thrown off balance, they have the capacity, the resources, the circumstances that allow them to restore emotional balance and predictability. That's the nature of stress. But what we think about in the work that we do is not just ordinary stress. The stress that says, oh, I've gotten up 5 minutes late, I guess I'd better move a little faster this morning. That's a little bit of stress and a little bit of restoration of equilibrium by how we adapt to it. Traumatic stress, which is what survivors of sexual and domestic violence encounter, is a kind of stress that is so strong that people on their own can't get back to center. And there's a graphic that I use that I think helps to really illustrate that. If you look at this lady, I love the skateboard lady, and I want to ask you, what do you see here? I've shown this slide a lot of places, and one of the most interesting answers I got was from someone whose son was a championship skateboarder, and she had a very fancy answer in terms of the nature of the trick that this skateboarder was performing. So not asking you that question, but here's a woman. What do you see? She's off balance, Kate says, but she'll probably be able to self-correct. And that's a great assumption, that all things being equal, she can probably get herself back on balance on her own. But you can't tell that for sure based on what you see here. And this is the situation we have, I think, when survivors come through the door. For the most part, the survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence who come through our doors are people who've been thrown off their normal balance by the events in their life. And now here's the question that I have to ask you. What would help you predict whether this skateboarder will be able to self-correct or whether she will not? What are the things that could happen to her? What do you imagine could happen? Here she is, she's in midair. Anybody here have kids who skateboard? There's a reason they wear knee pads. She could fall. She could fall. She could be off balance. She could land smoothly on her wheels and just go skating off into the distance. She could land beautifully. She could wipe out. All of those and a whole wide range of things could happen. And the question that then comes to mind is, what's going to determine whether she falls, wipes out, lands beautifully, or something else? What's going to determine that? Has she had experience before? Has she had experience at other times when she's had to, is this the first time she's ever been on a skateboard, or is she highly experienced? What else? How much support she has. And that support could be, is there someone saying, okay, now lean forward a little bit, straighten up your back, you'll be able to do it. Coaching and support and encouragement. It could also be whether there are barriers in front of her, with the surface that she's landing on. All of these are things that are going to determine how she is able to right herself, whether she's going to be thrown off balance in a way that she cannot re-regulate herself, or whether she's going to fall, re-regulate herself or fall. Now, what's important about that is it means that it's not just whether she's in some sense good enough, because it could also be that the skateboard has been tampered with by someone, or it could be that she's exhausted because she has been skateboarding for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. All of these are things that are comparable to the experience of the various survivors of sexual and domestic violence who come to us for services. How much is this particular person going to be able to right herself and get back to her own version of balance and equilibrium? And that means that our work as trauma-informed providers can never be one size fits all. It's for this reason that I want you to think about the fact that what we do is always going to vary, and the conversations, the way we talk to and work with and think about people is just as important, in some ways I think more important, than the concrete services that we provide. Her own version of balance and equilibrium, that's such an important point. Someone's commented on that, because what's equilibrium and balance for me in my life is going to be really different for someone whose life circumstances are different, someone who has more kids than I have, someone who has more physical energy or better health than I have. And that's really important, because as soon as we understand that each person's equilibrium is something that rises from inside her and reflects her, we don't have a one-size-fits-all version of success. And I'm hoping that somewhere in the background we have funders and board members and legislators who understand that you can't just have a checklist that says, did she get a place to live? Are her kids smiling 15 times every day, as a way of determining whether a family, an individual, has actually gotten back to balance and equilibrium or not. So that's just one kind of side point that I hope you'll think about. So, oops, too many slides. So as we think about that we're going to be providing advocacy to lots of different people who are doing their own version of getting back to balance. And these are things I'm also going to be saying in the staff version of this training this afternoon. We have to think about, what kind of advocacy are we really providing? What's our model? And I think it was Kate who mentioned that voluntary services are increasingly, we're called on to do voluntary services increasingly. And that's an important part of that as well. Because if we go back to the skateboard lady for a minute, what she may want from us is just the ability to land on her skateboard and step off. What she may want from us is the ability to skate really fast because she has somewhere to get, and this skateboard is going to help her get there. And we have to find out from each survivor with whom we work, what is it from our collection of skills, resources, information, energy, knowledge, out of all of what we have, what's going to help you get to where you want to get? Voluntary services gets distorted sometimes as meaning we have to get them to want what we offer. But voluntary services is really much more of a relationship, and that's why this kind of trauma-informed relational work is so important. I think about this as being, if there were two ends of a spectrum, are we doing advocacy that is working jointly with survivors on a project of their own choosing, which might be getting safe, getting my kids in school, having a chance to sleep 3 nights in a row so I can think straight? Or is our advocacy, here's some solutions that we have to your problem and we think you should choose them? That's in many ways the shift that we're talking about as we shift to voluntary services and as we shift to trauma-informed services. And for all of you, who I'm assuming almost everyone on the call is a leader, supervisor, manager in a program, we have to ask a comparable question. What's our model of supervision? If our model of advocacy is to be to advocate with people on projects and growth of their own choosing, well, now we can't say for staff, well, we just want them to work on whatever they want to because we have organizations to run and doors to keep open and somebody's got to get the bills paid and the floor swept and everything in between. But supervision is not the same as just deciding what has to be done. Supervision, and I'll talk a little bit later about a more complex model of supervision, our job as supervisors is really to build what I think of as a learning relationship, a relationship for learning, which means that as supervisors, we have the choice of either looking at the problems that staff bring and solving those problems for them, or working jointly with advocates on growing to be able to do their own jobs better. I'm remembering, and again, this is not in sexual or domestic violence work, but in another kind of human services work, I was coaching a program manager, and she was a top-notch worker, social worker, who was just fabulous at her work with clients and the young women with whom she worked. When she became a manager, all she did was do her staff's work for them. She would take on tasks that belonged to her staff because she wasn't sure that they would do them the way that she would. And she was exhausted because she was doing their work and she wasn't getting her own work done. As supervisors, we really want to find a way to help the staff with whom we work do their own jobs and do them better, understand their jobs, do them better, giving them the resources that they need. And learning how to do that is learning about how we talk to people about their work. So as supervisors who are going to be trauma-informed supervisors, we have to do both of these things. We do have administrative supervision. Is the paperwork getting in on time? Is the inventory in the shelter pantry counted properly? Have we gotten all of the court documentation done accurately? But we also need to do the reflective supervision that hands back to staff the work that they need to do. And that means using the kind of process we're going to talk about in a moment as an approach to problem solving rather than solving problems for survivors or for staff. Now, of course, we have to have content and professional knowledge and experience because there are times that that's the main thing we offer, but it's not the only thing we offer. Now, these last two pieces are really important when we become managers and supervisors. We have to be able to handle complicated relationships between people and know ourselves about how we tolerate some of that discomfort and some of the humanness of working with a group of people who are themselves every day encountering some of the worst stuff that happens in human life. And that means we have to understand and name and recognize that as leaders and managers and supervisors, we have power and how we use it. That's especially complicated in work like ours, where many times those of us in leadership positions are people with advanced degrees and who come from or who have created circumstances which give us more privilege in the world. And many times our staff, our part-time staff, may be paraprofessional staff who don't have as much education, who don't have as much opportunity, or have not had as much opportunity, and don't participate in some of the advantages that our culture provides. That makes it really hard to figure out, how am I a supervisor that empowers and gives strength to staff and that gives what I bring to this relationship hands it over to the people who are doing the work. We have to understand the power that we bring. Now, to talk about all of these things would be, what, Jen, 6 webinars? And so I'm just kind of touching on some of these issues. Some of these things are mentioned in other webinars that are on our website. Some of these things may be things that we would do in another webinar. But I want you to think about these issues and recognize that they are going to be on our minds as we start to talk about how we do these reflective conversations. So a reflective conversation is one that creates individuals and organizations that learn and organizations that change. And I want to show you a couple of little graphics that I use a lot that help us think about how do we help our staff and our organizations change and grow and improve. One thing we can do is to stand at the top of some ladder and drag people, pull people, urge people to join us. Have you had that experience as a supervisor or as an advocate? Is there anyone here who's had that experience in working with someone? Oh, come on, you can do it. Keep moving. Just pulling someone uphill. And I'm seeing a couple of yeses. How well does that work? And how do you feel when you're doing it? Is it fun? It's exhausting. The guy at the top, and I'm sorry that this is guys because so many of us are women in our work, but it doesn't really matter. And this is the graphic I found that came best to illustrating, and you wouldn't want something I drew. This just doesn't work. It's exhausting and trying to get someone, whether you're talking about a staff person or a survivor, to get to some new place that we think is the right place to go. So you can see that I don't advocate this as a way of getting organizations, creating organizations that learn and grow. Or we can set up a bunch of hoops, standards, service plans, whatever we want to call them, and stand at the side with the big megaphone and say, okay, jump through this one, now that one, now that one. Have you ever had a boss in another job? Have you ever had a boss who did that? I'm not going to ask you if you've ever done it. All of us have at times, I think, found ourselves wanting to do that. But yes, you've had that experience of a boss who's telling you, now jump through this hoop. How much are those folks learning as they jump through those hoops? How well are they growing and getting better at the jobs they have to do? I mean, they may be getting stronger as, I mean, if take an athletic analogy to a kind of crazy extreme, they may be getting physically stronger, but they're not building a path. And without someone standing there with a megaphone, they're not getting very much. You're not able to really learn to do something. And, yeah, you're just looking at what's the next hoop. Where am I going? Why am I jumping through all these hoops? It is not a fun way to work, and it's not a way of creating a learning organization. And this person with the megaphone might be saying, I work so hard to get these people. This kind of language comes up, right? I work so hard to get these people to do their jobs. I'm constantly, you can see how tiring it is to either be the supervisor or be the person being supervised in this way. Now, the next graphic that I'm going to show you, well, I'm going to ask you to think about this. Instead of those two methods, the reflective practice goal and the reflective supervision goal means that instead, staff are assessing their own performance, figuring out, gee, I didn't do that well. They're aware of their own strengths. They work with their limits and vulnerability, and this last point is so important. They make mid-course corrections. 0 to 3, this I want to just mention the credit is from 0 to 3, which is an organization that does a lot of really wonderful work around reflective supervision in early childhood education programs, and they have some very nice documents that you may want to look for if you're looking at more detailed discussions of how you actually do some of the pieces of reflective supervision until my book is done on domestic violence and sexual and reflective supervision. But in the meantime, 0 to 3 is doing really great work, and so a lot of their ideas are very, very helpful here. But when we use reflection, we empower staff to then take on the role of knowing the big picture, knowing what it is that they're trying to do. And it's really, I think of it as the lazy supervisor's way to work. You don't have to do other people's job. You can do your job, and you don't have to work nearly so hard. And it's much more fun to go to work each day. You feel more satisfied about the work that you're doing. The same thing is true when we're working with survivors. and this is what I'll be talking about this afternoon, that reflective practice means that we're not just saying to survivors, now jump through this hoop, now meet this goal, now do this kind of thing, now fill out this form, but instead, survivors who, unless you're going to take them home and adopt them, have to live their own lives. So our goal is to help them figure out how to grow, know what they can do, see where they need help, make mid-work corrections. And, you know, when you know, I'm sure this is true of you, it's true of most people I've encountered, when you know that something isn't going well and you trust the people around you, chances are you're going to ask them for help if it's safe. And we'll talk a little bit about what are those elements of safety in a bit. This is probably my favorite graphic of any of the ones that I ever use because it, well, that and Skateboard Lady. But I like this one a lot because what it does is it says that when we are working together with the staff or the survivors with whom we spend our working lives, we are reaching for stars together. And there are a couple important points about this. Who's the staff person and who's the manager in that picture? You really can't tell. And the model here is that there are many, many goals, and you and a survivor, you and a staff person working together can decide what is the thing that's most important to work on next. Now, if you're a manager, it may be that a staff person says, I just don't know what to say when a survivor says to me, I'm so sick of my kids. Now, all of us have said that about our kids at some time, but someone may say to us, I don't know what to do when someone says that. So then that can become a goal. That can become a star to reach for. Let's figure out how you can decide what to say. That's the beginning of a small reflective conversation. But it's important for managers to understand. If we go back to a slide a little bit ago when I talked about the both administrative and reflective supervisory responsibilities, we can also write goals on stars, like make sure the paperwork is done on time, keep the dollars rolling in that pay all of our salaries. And so that we, as managers, and again, this is a training that is sort of off the central topic here, but it's important to just kind of, again, put a place marker here, that we have a right as managers to invite our staff to work with us on the goals that we have. I want you all to know that I'm really focused on making sure that our budgets meet these goals so that we can make sure we have enough money coming in next year, which is a really different conversation than you guys are not getting your paperwork done. So what we're talking about here are joint relationships in the service of a learning, growing, successful organization. So let's move on, because I really want to get to how do we actually do this? How do we move from just thinking about it and philosophically? And our reflective supervision has to be reflective, of course. It is always collaborative, which means, remember I talked about power a minute ago? It means that we are not making our supervision about wielding power. It is about collaborating, making use of our greater skill, energy, experience, resources in the service of the well-being of the individual staff person and the organization. And this last point, and I'll come back to this at the end, I'll come back to this last point about regularity and some of the other administrative things at the end of our conversation, but regularity is key. It is very difficult to establish a new reflective supervision process without regular supervision. No matter how many other things that you have to do, your commitment to supervisory contact with your staff should be sacrosanct. Now, you may simply not have, if you've got 12 staff, you may not have 12 hours a week to give each person an hour of supervision every week. But I think you are a better supervisor if you offer each of those 12 people 20 minutes a week with 1 hour a month than if you just do hallway supervision. Because regularity gives people the opportunity to know, I know when I can talk to my manager, and it's not about, oops, I'm in trouble. It's, this is our chance to sit down and think together. So regularity is key, and we will come back to that a little bit. But the notion of reflection is something that I think is useful to take a look at for a second. What do we really mean about reflecting? I love this picture. He could be your brother, your partner, your son, your neighbor. It could be you. But what is this young man doing in this picture? And I'm going to really give you a chance to think about, what do you really see happening here? And we've all of us have been in that situation, right? Or you're in a store, and we've got the LL Bean outlet right here, and so we're always tempted to go do just this. As Kate says, self-assessment. What do you think are the questions in his mind? What is it you're asking yourself when you're looking in the mirror, checking on something that you've tried on, something new? Does this make me look good? How do I look? How am I doing? And how do you know if you look good? You probably have an image in your head. Is it flattering? Does it meet the occasion? Is it going to work for the party or the interview or the work day for me or the picnic? Some of us actually do have recreational lives as well. Does it work? Is it big enough? Is it too big? We're asking specific focused questions, and usually we're comparing what we reflect to some image in our head. Reflective practice is the same thing. It means taking a moment. He's not actually going to any of the places that are on his mind. This is just a time out from wearing clothes to checking on clothes. And reflective supervision is a time out from doing the work to checking on the work. And that's what we're talking about here. And a point that I think is really important, I talked about safety a moment ago. For our work as reflective supervisors to be effective, we have to make it safe for people, which means that the people with whom we work have to be able to come to us with, I don't know. And that when we as managers and supervisors and leaders hear, I don't know, or when we as an organization look at each other and say, I don't know, we don't have a clue what to do with this, that doesn't become paralyzing. And the way that question, I don't know, isn't paralyzing and isn't something that creates a sense of risk and worry is if we understand that every question, I don't know, points the way to I want to know. And that tells us how to then uncover what we need to know. Self-doubt is valuable. And that gives us a different stance on what we're doing in supervision. What is it that you're confused about this week in your work is not a gotcha question. It's a let's learn question. And I like this image of excavating learning because if you think about it, we don't learn nearly as much from the things that we do every week that always go well from when we have something that isn't going quite well and we figure it out. We excavate learning from our experience. And when we're using reflective supervision, the people that we're working with, they're not just coming to us and say, well, what should I do when the survivor says, I'm so tired of my kids? Instead of just saying, well, here's 6 things that you can say, what do you think? Have you ever encountered somebody else who had that experience? You start reflecting, right, looking in the mirror, and I don't mean just looking at oneself, but looking at the entire environment and all their experience in order to find the learning that's there. And then people own their own learning. Then people really have discovered how to do their jobs better, how to work better, how to connect better with survivors. So our relationship is one that first is safe and reliable to explore what happened and what we did. And I'm going to give you a very specific strategy for learning to do this. And the focus is not just on heads and beds. How many people came in the door? How much work did we do? How many units of service did we deliver? But rather on figuring out how did we work last week? What did we work on? How do we do better? How do we do it better? And where did we do it well? So it means that we as supervisors and the advocates with whom we work explore what worked best. What did we do? What is making a difference in how well I work with this survivor as opposed to that one, this situation as opposed to that one? And part of what we as supervisors do is to make it possible for a person to take that time out and think, okay, let's imagine that something else had happened last week. And this is a great trick. I actually learned this from my husband, a lawyer. When you've got to have somebody think about something difficult, don't say, well, let's imagine next week that a survivor comes to you and says, I really smacked my kids around last night. Ask them instead, imagine last week that someone had come to you and said, I've just been hearing a lot about child abuse in the state of Maine, which is why these images keep coming to my mind. Imagine that last week a survivor had come to you and said this. And when you use that kind of historical perspective in the hypothetical, it frees people to reflect. It frees people to think about really difficult situations without feeling like they're on the spot, because we already know it didn't happen last week. Okay, so reflection is a bunch of these kinds of tools and strategies for considering, well, what else could we do? How else might it have looked? What else do I think about that? And what's so interesting is that if we want the staff people who work with survivors in our agencies to provide this kind of reflective, engaged, empowering work with survivors, we have to give them the opportunity to experience. In all sorts of human services settings, I've seen situations where a staff person says, well, you expect me to do X, Y, and Z with the survivors with whom I work or the clients with whom I work in a child welfare setting, whatever. Nobody treats me that way. And that is such, we can kind of get our back up if a staff person says that to us, but in fact, that is the most legitimate comment that someone can make. You want me to be able to take the time to listen and really understand what this particular survivor needs at this moment? Nobody asks me that. And you've had that experience yourself probably if you've worked in this business for any length of time. So there's a real parallel process. Advocates with whom we work benefit from these conversations with survivors, and that conversation with us supports their capacity to be nurturing. And I don't mean nurturing as in caretaking. Oh, let me do that for you, and I'm going to take away all your pain. We can't do that, but how can I help you be strong enough to take the next step you need to take? So that's what we're talking about here. And we're going to do 2 exercises in order to really see how conversations support the model that I've just been telling you about. And that's where we're going for the rest of our time together. And the principle of strengths before struggles, I think, is a really good one when you're learning to do reflective supervision, when you're developing a reflective organization. Before you ask people to work on things that are hard and scary and uncertain, especially if your organization is making a shift from a more traditional top-down form of supervision to this more empowering supervision, you have to give people an opportunity to feel the experience and to feel you as this new kind of supervisor, or that you're expanding this way of supervising. And that's why I say strength before struggle. So we're going to use the Gibbs model of reflective conversations to think about some success. And I'm going to ask you to actually do this with me. And for the first part, I want you to think about something in either your work as a supervisor or your work as an advocate that's gone really well, that you kind of took it home in your hip pocket and said, yeah, that's why I do this work. I'm not bad. I really did something that helped. How many of you can think of such a situation looking back in your work life? I hope you can. And I'm going to invite people, if they want to share a little bit about what such an experience might have been. But it's not really that important to say what happened, because what's more important is what can you extract and learn from the work that we're going to do together. Okay, so can most of you remember such a situation where you looked back and said, yes, I can do this work. I'm good at it. I helped. I made a difference. I'm waiting for some yeses before we go on. Great. So you have had that experience. So pick one, and we're going to take a look at the Gibbs model of reflective conversations to think about how you actually hold a reflective conversation with yourself. And then we'll talk about, after we've talked about how to do these conversations with yourselves, we'll talk about how you bring them into your organizations. Okay? So some of the questions might be, what's on my mind about my work this week? Is there anything I'd like help with? But for this exercise, what has gone well in my work, not just this week, but in the past at some point. So I would like to erase, if I can make the eraser work, this week. We're going to erase this week and just say, what has gone well at my work at some time? Okay? And this is a summary of the Gibbs reflective cycle, and then we're going to switch to one of the handouts. Okay, so this is one version of a reflective conversation, and there are lots of different models of this. In this instance, we start with something that happened. How did I feel? What did I experience? And what do I learn about that? How well did it go? Did it go well? Did it go poorly? Let's analyze it. let's figure out what was going on, and we're going to get in more detail this. Then we come to a conclusion, and based on that conclusion, we develop an action plan. Okay, so let's switch to this handout, which some of you may have on paper, but this is the same thing, so you can just look at it here as well. And I think mostly it fits on our screen here, depending, I guess, on your monitor and how well it's holding this whole image. This is the reflective cycle. A lot of people have sort of adapted this. But again, where we would start is with this question. What am I going to reflect on? So think about the thing that I asked you to remember, the thing that you experienced, that you think that went well. Can you remember what you were thinking or feeling? And can someone share what they were thinking or feeling when you had that success? And it might have been a successful conversation with a staff person in a supervisory setting. It might have been saying what turned out to be just the right thing to help a survivor think about herself and her situation, or just getting all the pieces of paperwork together right away to get an order of protection, or helping somebody with getting ready to go to court to confront the person who assaulted her. And what were you thinking and what were you feeling at that moment when you were doing that? Can anyone share something of what that experience was? And as you're thinking about that, what I'm going to sort of suggest is that this is a strategy that you can use to begin the work in individual supervision or in staff meetings to help people start to understand what went well when it went well. Kate says, I felt like I was in sync with the person. I felt like we felt collaborators. Jen says, I felt connected to the other person. Other people may have other comments. Isn't it interesting that nobody here is saying, I knew all the rules. I had all the paperwork in place, although those things are important too. But you're understanding, how do I engage with this other person in a way that lets me see them? So when something went well, you felt connected, you collaborated, you were engaged with the person. And then the next question, and of course I'm flying through this, but if we were doing this in a more relaxed kind of way, we would really take time to explore this. What was good about the experience? How can you make sense of what happened? How do you analyze the situation? What made it go so well? Why did I feel in sync with that person? You have an idea, and you may not want to share everything about that, but can you make sense of why it is that it went so well? Is it because we went to the same high school and we knew each other really well? Or was it because I just understood, or because we'd had an earlier conversation? I remember years ago working in a shelter with a woman where the thing that got us really connecting with each other is that, and this will tell you how long ago it was, I stood with her over a wash basin, and together we washed out diapers from her baby. So this is a long time ago. This is the days before Pampers. But there was something about that connection made her feel safe enough to let me know more of her dirty laundry, so to speak. Were there other ways that I could have accomplished that same goal? And what can I learn from it moving forward? And so I've just walked you really, really quickly through the process of reflecting on a positive experience. I'm going to go back to the slides because I want to take the rest of our time to think about. I'm going to skip this slide because it's basically summarizing what we've just said. And instead, I'm going to ask you to do a harder thing now. And here, I want to ask you to think about a problem, a difficulty that you've had in your working life, being stuck, or for that matter, it could be a situation with your family or your kids. I mean, if you have teenagers, I have a 15-year-old, Lord knows there are times that I need the skills with her as much as anything else. But think about a problem, a difficulty, a stuck situation, an interpersonal struggle, or something else that you feel like you'd like to work on. Please keep the content private, but I'm hoping that you will share the learning in the rest of the time that we have together. And let's go back to here. Jen, can you help me find the reflexive supervision page 2 of this graphic? There, thank you. See, it helps when you have somebody who knows what she's doing. So here what I want to talk about is a reflexive conversation where it's not just reflecting, but it's reflecting and acting. I'm hoping that each of you, looking here on the first column now, has thought of a problem, difficulty, a reason for being stuck, a reason you don't get along with someone, and we're going to just walk through these questions. And if an insight comes to you, please type it into the box. Again, not about the content of the event, but what can you learn about this stuck situation as you think through these? What has your role been in the problem or the difficulty? What were you trying to achieve? Or what are you trying to achieve with a staff person that you're supervising or an action that you took? What action did you take? What did you do? And what was the other person or person's response? What were the consequences? And again, I'm flying through this because our time is so short. And what feelings did that action invoke? And what was good or bad about it? So if we take that time out, go into the fitting room, so to speak, like standing in front of the mirror, that time out, and really understand, what is this? Not trying to fix it right away. And this is a really important point when you're thinking about reflection. You can't go barreling from, I see a problem, to here's the fix, do this. You have to have the time to look at it and struggle with it and examine it. What does that first column analysis teach me? What is the problem? So what does this tell me about me, about the survivor with whom I'm working, about other people in the organization, about our relationship? What does it tell me about my advocacy with this survivor or my supervision with this staff person? Oops, there's a typo there. What does it tell me about my advocacy with the survivor, my supervision? What is the model of advocacy or supervision that I'm using? Am I just trying to tell someone what to do, get them to jump through hoops? What was going through my mind as I said that? What did I base my actions on? What other knowledge can I bring to the situation? What could I have done to make this better? Do you see how this reflection really gives us a chance to separate out something that we're looking at from what do I need to do, so that the action is really the last step of this conversation and not the first. I believe that we only go until 11, so I think we are very, very close to the end of our time together. Am I right on that, Jen? And I've been, we have till 11:30? Oh, hooray. Oh, that's great news. Thank you, Kate. Somehow I had it in my head that we were only going till 11. Then let's slow down. I'm going to stop and ask you to take a look at this and to ask, has anything come to mind about the problem that you're thinking about as you begin to look at this model? Any thoughts as you think about taking time out without the anxiety of having to rush to a solution? And again, I need my Jeopardy music. Da, 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 da. If we don't have a specific thought, then I'm going to jump on one. Okay, so here's some, okay, so here are some thoughts. It takes us outside of ourselves, and it really gives us the opportunity to take several steps back. Let's go back to the question that someone raised earlier in the day about what do we do about having staff in many different places. What I'm going to suggest is that once you've used this reflexive conversation model with yourself and with a peer so that you have a feel for how it works, you can begin a process of reflective conversations with the staff people with whom you work. And just as, to go back a couple of slides, strengths before struggles. If I was trying to manage multiple locations, one of the things that I would do would be to try to make sure that I get in front of every staff person on a predictable, at a predictable rate. if there are staff people I never see, then that's my problem as a supervisor. I remember years ago when I was working in a domestic violence organization, I started having some of the staff meetings at 7:30 at night because that meant the overnight staff who had experiences and knowledge about the organization that no one else had could participate. That if I'm always running meetings and holding meetings at my convenience, with the convenience of the most senior staff, then I'm not doing my job as a reflective manager or supervisor to engage everyone. So that's one of the first things that I think I would do. But let's ask those of you who supervise multiple locations, when has that worked best? Let's use this model and see how that goes. Is someone willing to have that conversation with me? Here, let's go back to here. When has that worked best? Okay, regular channels of communication across sites, and that's absolutely right, that you can't let it be ad hoc, that it's really critical. Can you describe what those regular channels of communication are? Are they only when there's a problem, everybody knows who's going to get reported or how to make a report? You know, ideally not. I think that one of the things that I would do if I had multiple locations would be to try to find some way to get, as I said, to get myself physically in front of every staff person on a regular basis without a huge agenda of my own. If the only time you meet with staff is when you have something to say to them, you miss the opportunity to do this work. And you can't go in having never done reflective supervision and suddenly jump right into the middle. One of the strategies that I've taught, which I think is a way of getting us to think about beginning this process, is to use meetings to have some of these strengths-based conversations. Jen, can you put up, please, the link to the success jar? I think it's a tip sheet on our website, which is a kind of hokey version of a way to begin conversations in an organization that says, I want to take the time out to see what goes well every week. Because part of reflection means excavating, learning from our successes, and then moving from that to how do we use that when things have gone badly. When we have multiple sites and we are only talking to the squeaky wheel, we're only showing up and engaging when things are difficult, that makes it very, very hard to build this kind of supportive, growth-inducing organization with staff we don't see regularly. So I might make it harder for people to come to me to complain. Well, no, I don't think I want to say that. But I think I would make it regular and ordinary for people to come to me with successes and to come together, even without me, about successes and about strengths and excavating strengths, and to make it extraordinary to come together to talk about difficulties. Now, that takes discipline on our part as managers, because it's very, very easy when we've got so much to do to put these positive things last. And yet, I strongly believe that if we engage with our staff when things are going well about what's working, then you start to collect a toolkit. You have a collection of things that you can turn to. What have you done in the past that's made this work well, and how can you do that now? I don't know if that's a practical answer to the multiple locations, but multiple locations really means in some ways that you've got to have organizations and individuals who become self-managing, because you can't be there and be an on-site, I'll do it for you kind of manager. Does that make sense? That you then have to really get to a place where each of those groups can answer their own questions and have ways to safely come together, where power is not the main reason where the power relationship is not the primary feature of the relationship between manager and supervisor, but instead that the primary feature of the relationship is about inducing growth. So here's something that might be a useful question, a strategy for beginning to do this. You might send an email out to all of your programs saying, I'm going to come around over the next 2 weeks to every site with one question, which is, tell me something that you've done really well, something that's been a success. And a version of that might be an unexpected success, something that you didn't expect to go well. And we're just going to describe what it was. Think about the shift that that has in an organization when people know, gee, our manager's coming in to hear about how things went really, really well. When we did that thing that we were like, oh, wow. That begins a sense of saying that you are invested in them as growing, expanding individuals rather than simply as people doing tasks. So that's part of what I would suggest. I want to go back then, since I've been barreling through this because I was not clear about our time, even though I had it right in front of me, to go back to this reflexive conversation graphic and think about it in more detail. Okay, so what is the problem? We've just said the problem is I can't talk to everybody individually. I don't see everyone every week. What's my role? And I'm not necessarily talking about the individual person who described her situation in this way, but generically, what's my role in not being able to get to each staff person once a month? Is that because I'm always caught up troubleshooting? Is it because I haven't organized how meetings take place? Because I haven't asked people, how can I get there to have conversations with all of you? So what am I trying to achieve when I connect with people? And how do people respond where when I show up, it's like, oh, dear, the boss is here? These are the kinds of things that we can start to look at when we take a reflective stance. And it occurs to me that it's important to make another point about that, which is that when we do this reflexive process, if you're going to hear noise for a second, I'm just opening a window. One really important thing in doing this reflexive work is that we have to also make it safe for ourselves. Think about that. It's scary being the manager. It's scary being an executive director because really the buck stops with you. And if things are not going well, you feel like it's all on you to fix it. So as you start to move towards a new form of supervision, do this in a way that also helps you understand which is the piece of this that makes me feel safest, what's scary for me about this, what feels like a risk, and to be gentle with yourself as you move towards a new strategy. Now, it occurs to me also that a question that might be in the back of some of your minds is, what does this have to do with trauma? Because, in fact, I haven't said very much about trauma responses. I haven't said very much at all about what it is about living through and surviving sexual or domestic violence or both that is relevant, that on the face of it is relevant to what we're talking about. But, in fact, human beings always deal with, and I'm putting this in quotes, stuff, stress, things that knock us off center. And the thing that makes it possible for people to get back on balance, going back to the skateboard lady, the thing that makes it possible to get back on balance is a combination of supports from the outside, skill and experience of our own, resources, and all of those pieces together. That's trauma responsive work, not trauma specific healing the nightmares, mind you, but trauma responsive, helping a person get her resources together to do the next best step for herself. And if we are building organizations that are all about take this step, do this next thing, fill out this form, accomplish this goal, that is not little e empowering, in the sense that it isn't about asking what are the skills and capacities that I can help this person develop to do the next thing as the next thing that seems to make sense to her. One of the hardest, well, I don't know about hardest, but one of the things I know that comes up a lot in our work with survivors of sexual and domestic violence is that many of us, managers and staff alike, are ourselves survivors of similar kinds of experiences. And it can be a kind of knee-jerk early response to think, well, I handled it this way, why don't you? Have you seen that in yourself? Have you seen that in the folks that you've worked with, the staff that you supervise? Or I managed to get better or to handle it without all of these extra supports. Why do you need all of this extra help? And if that happens, it can be very difficult to offer survivors the resources that they need for their next best step. And I think it's critical to believe that the people with whom we work, and now I'm talking specifically about survivors, have somehow managed to keep breathing, maybe really raggedly, but they managed to keep breathing before they ever met us. And if we value that, this is, I think, the essence of trauma-informed practice. If we value that they have found a way to keep going and they show up at our doorstep somehow, or they roll up to our doorstep saying, here I am, what now? We can ask these same kinds of questions to respond to a person's experience of traumatizing violence of whatever sort. When we are trauma-informed, one of the first layers, I think, is to understand some of the specific physiological and emotional reactions, interpersonal reactions that are common to survivors of trauma. But once you've read those things and learned those things and come to recognize that someone's emotional lack of regulation is not just because she's mean and cranky and doesn't like me, but because trauma makes it very, very difficult for someone to remain on an even keel. That's the first step, to recognize that a person's emotional reactivity may reflect the intensity of the trauma that she's experienced. But then, what do we do next? I think about situations working with survivors in group settings, whether it's in a group or in a residential setting of some sort, where someone may be very, very likely to fly off the handle. We may understand that privately as being a trauma response, but how do we manage it? And we can either manage it by saying, if you do that again, you're going to get written up, and if you do it 3 more times, we're going to kick you out, or we're not going to offer you services anymore. Or we can use a very similar reflexive process, and this is part of what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. Mary Lou, we might say, I hope there's no Mary Lou in the room, Hortense. I understand that last week you had 3 or 4 times where you were really shouting. And I wonder what you thought about that. Can we talk about that? Not whether you're in trouble and if you don't fix it, you're going to be, there's going to be something happen to you, but what was your thought about that? What were you trying to achieve? Well, they were scaring me, and I'm going down this list. What were you trying to achieve when you were shouting at the people on the other side of the room? How did other people respond? Did they get you where you wanted to get? And what were the consequences for you? Well, now nobody talks to me. You see how what you're doing here is unpacking a situation, whether it is a particular episode in a shelter or something broader in the relationship, and actually helping someone to walk through the what, so what, now what. Being trauma-informed really is not that different than just being human. It's believing that people do the best they can at every moment, and that if our role is not to try to fix the thing that's wrong with them, as Kate has just mentioned, but to understand what's happened and how has it affected you, and what would you like to do next. It's really hard when we do this work and we have a vision of where someone could be, and that's not where she wants to go. I'm sure you've had that experience. And part of being trauma-informed and reflective, is also to be able to take a step back from that vision, right? The jump through this hoop, you'd really have a good time, as opposed to what would you like to write on the stars? What would make you feel like this has been a worthwhile time of our working together? And then taking that really seriously. There's another question here in the chat. How do you take time out when you feel overwhelmed by the demands of the work? You don't have time. Whose fault is it? I'm going to ask all of you. Whose fault is it that you don't have twice the staff that you have in your agencies, which might begin to meet the need of survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence in your community? Is that your fault? It's not our fault individually, and it's not something that we are responsible for. And so I think the place to start is by recognizing that there's always going to be more work than we can do. There's always going to be more need than we can respond to. And once you put at least for me, when I put myself in the center of that reality and I realize I can't meet the need of every survivor that I encounter and recognize, then the question becomes, what can I do? And how do I say to someone, I can't? A simple example that I use often is if you're at the end of your work shift and a survivor comes to you, and again, I'm thinking in a shelter context because that's most of the training that I've done most recently, but someone comes to you, whatever setting you're in, and says, I need to talk to you about this issue right now, and you have 12 minutes because you know if you don't get to your daycare center in time, they're going to start charging you $15 a minute for every minute you're late to pick up your 4-year-old. Have you been there? So that's a terrible situation to be in. And so how do you say, this sounds like it's something that's going to take us an hour, you might say to the survivor. It's going to take us an hour to really think through, and here's where we are right now. I have 12 minutes before I have to be in my car because I have to leave. And you don't necessarily want to say, because I have to go get my kids. It's not necessary to say that. I have to leave in 12 minutes. What piece of that can we do right now, or who can I connect you with to work on that more this afternoon? That's one of the first things about taking time out, is knowing how to say a loving, respectful no that takes care of you and the person with whom you work. Sometimes we are so flooded by the reality of the need and the intensity and the desire of the people with whom we work and of ourselves, our own wish to make it all right yesterday, that we lose sight of the fact that I can only do one person's worth of this work. And I want to make that the best that I can, the most effective, the most responsive, but that's all that I can do. And when you are really in that place, then what you do with a full heart, and you can do 100%. So how do you take time out when you feel overwhelmed by the work demand? You have to. And you do have time. And sometimes what happens, I think, is that we believe that someone else's need always takes precedence over our own need. And I think that I need to pick up, and sub-rosa, you're not going to say this aloud necessarily, I need to get to the daycare center because I don't want to spend $15 a minute paying for overtime daycare. That's a real need, and it counts. But also is the need of, I need 5 minutes to breathe, massage my shoulders, drink a cup of tea before I talk to the next survivor who's going to come into my door. That need is just as real. So how do you take time out? You make sure that you legitimize it. So let's use the reflexive conversation question. If I had a staff person who came to me for a conversation, and my supervisory question might be, and I'm going to see if I can get back to that slide, what's on your mind about your work this week? Is there anything you'd like help with? What's gone well in your work this week? And she comes to me and says, I'm overwhelmed. There's too much to do. How do I take time out? Let's answer that question. Okay? What is the problem? Not being able to get a minute to breathe and not to be able to renew myself enough to be able to keep doing the work. What's your role in the situation? What action are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to achieve? I'm trying to meet every need as soon as it comes up. What is the response of others? There's always more need than I can meet. What are the consequences for the survivor of my saying no? What are the consequences for me of not saying no? What are the consequences for my colleagues? If I'm a manager and my message to staff is you have to give until you're exhausted, how does my staff hear that? The staff in our organization is going to think that that's how they have to work as well. What feelings does it evoke in me to never say no, to never take time out for myself? Let's ask you that. If you don't take time out when you feel overwhelmed, what feelings does it invoke in you? Even if what you're trying to achieve is to give everything you possibly can and meet every need as soon as it shows up, what happens inside us? We start to feel resentful. What else happens? You start to feel bitter. I mean, it's a really short step from those feelings to things that I know I've heard in various places. These women are not grateful. I work so hard, and even so, they really still want more. They want too much. I sometimes use, so the feelings it evokes in us, we may have been going back up. We may have been trying to achieve meeting everybody's needs and having no one suffer ever. But the feelings that it invokes actually takes us away from engagement with survivors or away from engagement with staff. So what's good about trying to meet everybody's needs and never saying no? Well, it makes me feel like I'm Superwoman. it makes me also bitter and resentful and miserable. So let's go to the next column. So what? Now that we've learned that never saying no, never taking time out really isn't accomplishing this, what I was trying to accomplish, what does it tell me about me? And I'll talk about myself for a minute. I know it took me a long, long time in this work to recognize my own grandiosity, that somehow I wanted to be super advocate. As a YouTube video, it's a French TV ad that always makes me laugh, and it makes me think about our work. And it shows a leopard or something, a cheetah or something, chasing a gazelle and running it down. And then suddenly you see a man run into the frame, and he goes galloping past this predator, scoops up the gazelle, and runs out of the picture. And when we show that, Carol shows that to advocates, Carol Warshaw, who's the director of the National Center, shows that to advocates. We all laugh because, in fact, that's who we are. All too often we're trying to rescue every gazelle that's being chased by a lion. So what does it tell me about me if I never want to say no, if I never take time out, that somehow I feel like I'm going to be super advocate? What does it tell me about the survivor? That I think the survivor has nothing to bring on her own, that it isn't a connection between the two of us doing this next step. If I think, does it mean I think that no one else can do the work? What's the model of advocacy that I'm using? If I feel like I can never say, this is as much as I can do today, I'll be back at 9:15 tomorrow morning. What are my attitudes? Do I really think that survivors bring nothing of their own to the table, or not enough of their own to the table? What was going through my mind as I didn't say no and made myself late to pick up my kid from daycare? What did I base my actions on? And if someone is in need of, emergency medical care, then you need to be with her and get her to a doctor. That might be worth the $15 an hour or figuring that out. But not everything that feels like an emergency is an emergency. What other knowledge can I bring to the situation when a survivor says, this is so urgent, I have to deal with this right now? You might remember that there are 4 other staff on, or that you'll be back tomorrow, or, gee, if I had done this 2 days earlier, then it wouldn't have been an emergency now. So that instead of just this was good, this was bad, you actually start to unpack the situation. Ideally, we then develop a new understanding of the situation and discover broader issues. If this keeps coming up, then maybe we do need to have someone who's on between 4 and 6, because so many things come up that we're not able to respond to. But then it becomes a practical question and not, can I be super advocate? And then once we've discovered these things, then we can start to actually ask step question, now what? The third step question, now what? What do we actually need to do to make things better when survivors come with strong needs, or when staff are always feeling an emergency? What do I need to do to stop being stuck in this situation? What broader issues need to be considered, and what might be the consequences of this new action? So I'm hoping that that gives you a little bit richer feeling for how this works. I want to move us into thinking about some of the organizational issues, but let me stop for a moment and just ask if there are questions about what we've just gone moving through fairly quickly in the last few minutes. Any questions, thoughts, reactions? I'm hoping that you have some ideas about how to turn this way of thinking about connections with our staff to actually doing supervision. Our individual sessions of supervision can be all about heads in beds, as I put it, paperwork, physical goals, things that could be communicated through email and on paper. And I believe really strongly that our supervisory contact with staff should not primarily be about those kinds of material things. Our supervision should really be that learning opportunity so that we ask a staff person, what pieces of your job do you need help to do better? Where are things not working well? What are things that you don't yet know? How many times do you ask that question in a supervisory session? Hi, come on in, have a seat. Do you want a cup of tea? What's on your mind about your job this week? I think that should always be the first question in a supervisory meeting. And most of the time, for many of us, it's not. And if we have a list, if we come to a supervision session with a list, that should never, in my opinion, be the first thing that we talk about. Okay, I've got 7 things that I want to talk about today. What's on your mind? Does not open a reflective conversation. Whereas asking a question like, what's on your mind about your work this week? Well, I was really happy that X, Y, and Z happened, but I was very nervous when I went to court with the survivor, and I wasn't quite sure how this particular judge was going to react. Okay, so can we work on that? Has that happened before? Are there other judges that you're more comfortable with, that you know more about? What do you think we could do so that the next time you're in front of this judge, what did you learn from being in front of this judge? Now, that is not necessarily going to tell you how many units of service were delivered, but hopefully you can find that out from a piece of paper or an email. Whereas the opportunity to help somebody think through how she could approach a judge who scares her and the survivor to death is a more useful, I think, a more useful application of your knowledge and your experience to supporting and teaching and guiding staff to do their jobs better. What else is making sense from this work, from this conversation? I want to make sure that we have a minute to talk about these organizational issues because they are so important. If we are going to build trauma-informed, reflective organizations, then we really can't do that just by wishing to. There has to be a commitment at all levels of the organization, which means that the person who answers the phone and the person who sweeps the floor is just as important to the success of our organization as the executive director. And if we don't treat those folks as important, then that's not going to be reflected in how they work. I remember doing a training in some state, I don't remember exactly where it was, where the cook, we had all the staff there, and the cook in this big shelter who cooked for all the survivors really didn't understand where she was and what the work was and what the story was with the survivors with whom she worked. And it was reflected in how she fed people. And the work that we did together so that she understood how her feeding families in trouble, families at risk, families under stress, was a critical part of helping to heal their experience of trauma. It changed the atmosphere in meals in this organization. And that was really a critical thing to see happen. Time management is important. You've got to make time for good supervision. It cannot be on the fly because people will not come to you to say, this went really well, if they believe you're always too busy to listen to them. And you don't get good information about what's happening in your organization if you don't take the time to listen. And that means that looking at your schedule and asking, where do you make yourself too busy to do the primary supervisory job, which is that paired sense of both administrative and reflective supervision. Have you ever had a job where you weren't sure who your boss was and who actually made the rules? You have to know the organizational supervisory structure for reflective supervision to go well. When people don't know who is directing their work, it can be very, very difficult for them to be able to manage, and they're always trying to figure out, well, now, who do I make happy now, as opposed to who's going to help me learn, who's going to help me do my job better. And our HR practices, our performance goals, someone mentioned goals. If we really focus on written goals as a person's, as the structure for how we guide someone to do their job better, we have to be really certain that those are goals that are not so stuck to mechanical outcomes that they don't give us the opportunity to help people grow as professionals at whatever level they're working in the organization. So that means your HR folks have to understand reflective practice, and we have to make sure that our agency values and our philosophy are reflected in the way we actually do workplace practices. That's a critical point. I see we have 1 minute left. I said before, I don't know, points the way to I want to know. Keep that in mind. And what I would love to hear from you by email or text, I guess email would be the easiest way. Where does this very fast webinar leave you? What do you want to know? What do you want to learn next about reflective supervision? I thank you for your attention. I'm going to be quiet so that Erin can take the time that she needs to close our session together. And thank you very much for your engagement and for the work, the hard work that you do on behalf of survivors.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank Terry Peace and the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance for such an incredible webinar today, and thank you to Jen Curley for making sure that the webinar ran smoothly. Last but not least, we want to thank you for spending your time with the center today. Within the next week, I'll send you all a follow-up email with the link of today's recording, in addition to the handouts that Terry referenced. At the end of the webinar, in just a few moments, you'll be taken to a very brief evaluation. If you could please take a moment to let us know what was useful and what could have been better, it would be really appreciated. Thank you all again, and we hope you all have an excellent afternoon. Take care.